Hey everyone, what's going on? So the big news on April 21st was the death of Pope Francis. And there's a whole bunch of very simple things in relation to Gematria that you could talk about with this, such as how his full name equals 111, and he died on the 111th day of the year, and he supposedly died of a stroke that equals 88, and he died at the age of 88. And of course, 421 is the day that Rome was supposedly founded in history. And Rome was founded by Romulus. Remember that Pope Francis was hospitalized on Valentine's Day, which is the second day of the Roman wolf festival called Lupercalia, which is to honor the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus. So it's interesting he would go to the hospital during Lupercalia, and then he ends up dying on the day Rome was founded in history. But I'm not going to talk about simple things in this video. There's a way more detailed and complex narrative that I have been following for the past year, and all had to do with father symbolism. And this father symbolism, I pointed out multiple times how it could be connected to priests and Pope Francis. And there's a thing with two fathers as a theme that I've been following. So I thought maybe there was something connected to Pope Francis and also Father Howard Fitzgerald, who was a priest I had as a kid, who we've always joked that molested me, and he eventually did get kicked out of the church in 2014, or the story came out in 2014 about him molesting kids, and Pope Francis kicked him out of the church after 35 years, and so on. And we recently just had the priest from Erling, Iowa, that I have talked about. This guy right here, the priest that's just 13 miles away from where I live, where Father Howard used to be a priest also, he died on my father's birthday, April 11th. But Father Howard, his birthday, just so happens to be 111. So it's pretty interesting that his birthday would be 111. Pope Francis just dies on the 111th day of the year, and his full name equals 111. But the big thing that I have learned this year due to following this father symbolism is the importance to these composite numbers and this cipher that uses composite numbers that we've put together because of it. And a lot of this stems back to Aleister Crowley and this number 200 or 418. And I'm going to go back and explain a whole lot of things, but I'm just trying to bring up the point that I've learned a lot about these composite numbers and the importance and how it's related to the father symbolism. And when I first learned about the number 418 and the importance to Aleister Crowley, it was from a comment from Zenith of the Alpha back in, I think, September of 2023. And what he was pointing out was that, you know, the Book of the Law, on some of the covers of the Book of the Law, has the Roman numeral for 93, and it says equals 418 to 666. So Awas, the being who told Aleister Crowley the Book of the Law, equals 93 and 418, and he's the great beast 666. So this number 418, I never knew about it with Aleister Crowley before. I didn't know the importance. And what Zenith was pointing out was, I was talking about this when Rambo got kicked off the Gematria episode on the Ides of March. I was talking about how it was all linked up to Zach's radio show, and all these things were linked up to Rambo with that radio show. And Rambo's first ever time that he called in just so happened to be on the date 418, which just so happens to be Zachary K. Hubbard's father's birthday. But what Zenith had pointed out was that Zach's first ever episode of the Gematria effect that was on Truth Frequency Radio, it was a span of 93 days after Prince's birthday, Prince the singer, and that his episode was also a span of 4 months and 18 days after the day Prince died. And remember, Prince died on the date 421, just like how Pope Francis just ended up dying on the date 421. And even more interesting is the fact that we learned about these to look into composite numbers due to some guy calling into Zach's live stream on February 25th last year And notice the title is about Joseph Aquaviva. It involves Joseph Aquaviva, and that was 4 months and 18 days before the Donald Trump assassination attempt, which turned out to be super related to Aleister Crowley, such as how it was 4 months and 18 days before the anniversary of Aleister Crowley dying, and it was also 337 days before Donald Trump's birthday, and the 337th composite number just so happens to be 418. And a whole slew of other things that I will explain as this video goes along. But it all had to do with Aleister Crowley and this number 418. And once again, we learned about it in this video that was connected to Joseph Aquaviva. And then on September 1st, Zach ended up making random videos about Mark Passio's father dying and also about Joseph Aquaviva's father dying. And if you read through this post, I talked all about the number 421 that I will get back to. But I mean, there's a million things. Zach's full name equals 421. He made that video 4 months and 21 days after my father's birthday. Mark Passio's name equals 421. Zach's father's name in the composite ciphers equals 421. Zach's parents' birthdays are 4 months and 21 days apart. A whole bunch of other things, And Pope Francis even ended up dying 421 days later after learning about the guy calling into that show on February 25th, 2024. Pope Francis died 421 days later on 421. And once again, think about that connection to Aleister Crowley and the number 418. And, he made this video about 2 fathers dying on that day. And then a few days later, the mainstream media stories, the two headline stories on CNN, there was one about a father over here, and then there was another one about a different father. So 2 fathers. And then we had the death of James Earl Jones, and then the death of John Amos, who are the 2 fathers on the movie Coming to America, and a whole slew of other things. Just before Pope Francis went to the hospital, I talked about how Zach did a random live stream with a guy named American Fathers. And believe it or not, this guy's birthday was June 24th, which is this huge day that I followed with the father symbolism. And that live stream just so happened to be 4 months and 21 days before his birthday, the number 421. And I went on once again to talk about Pope Francis, right? And father, and how this was all linked up to father symbolism. I talked all about the number 421 and how this Aleister Crowley and composite numbers thing seems to go back to Prince, the singer, who died on 421, and now Pope Francis ends up dying on 421. And there's even more to it. Like I said, I want to go back and re-explain why I'm talking about what I am saying, but I'm trying to keep you interested in relation to what I am talking about. But when Zach made that video about Joseph Aquaviva's father and Mark Passio's father on the same day, that was 233 days before Pope Francis died. And if you read out Pope Francis's name, Jorge Bergoglio or Gaglio, it equals 233. Joseph Aquaviva's father died on the 233rd day of the year. And if you look at when we first started looking at composite numbers, 233 was the big number that I was like, I knew there was some mystery behind it, and I didn't know what it was. I saw things like how Donald Trump equaled 233 in the composite cipher. And it was linked up to a whole bunch of stuff with the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, which I will get into in relation to Pope Francis dying at the age of 88, and how that is all linked up to Super Bowl 52, that was linked up to a big narrative with bridges. But another interesting thing in relation to composite numbers is that if you go back and look at this video here where the guy called in about composite numbers, and then everybody started researching about composite numbers, or not everybody, but that's when we started doing it. This video actually came out 296 days before Pope Francis's birthday. 296 just so happens, the 296 composite number just so happens to be 233. So hopefully that makes sense. I do want to go back and explain the history, and hopefully it will make more sense. I know it's very detailed, and there's a lot to remember, but what are the odds I'm talking about all this 421 with the father symbolism and how it's linked to these narratives that I'm following with composite numbers, Aleister Crowley, and Prince, the singer, who died on 4/21, and then Pope Francis, who's linked to the father symbolism, ends up dying on the date 4/21, the same day that Prince died. It's also the same day that Queen Elizabeth died, and oddly enough, Queen Elizabeth died on Zachary K. Hubbard's mother's birthday, and Queen Elizabeth died 4 months and 18 days after her birthday, 4/18. And I'm not even saying it's done on purpose, but it's also interesting that recently Zach he changed his channel name to Number Games instead of Gematria Effect. Gematria Effect, right? He just changed it to Number Games. And then he also has the new one called Count on It. And the first video that he posted on the actual Count on It channel was on the date 4/18, even though he made the video the day before. The one that's on the actual channel was 4/18. And then now today he starts the new one called Number Games. It was actually called something else before that, but he changed it to Number Games later in the day. But I just find it interesting that, he's got two new podcast names, and, just think about how it was related to the Gematria Effect that I'm talking about. And with Rambo and 4/18 and Prince. And another thing is, last year he started a new podcast called Wake the Fuck Up. It was called Wake the Fuck Up Radio. And if you write out Wake the Fuck Up, Wake the Fuck Up Radio, it equals 418 in these Francis Bacon ciphers. Something that I've talked a whole lot about as well. And maybe I'll explain the importance of why I've been following these as well, but notice it equals 418 in the capital letter ciphers, which is also interesting with Donald Trump and the Capitol insurrection. And today's 4/24, which is big with Donald Trump, and the capital letter ciphers, Donald Trump equals 424. It's a whole bunch of stuff. Russia and Ukraine, big in the news. Remember, Donald Trump touched the Western Wall at 4/24, and they said he was like the savior of Ukraine, and his name in the Hebrew lettering of some sort equals 424, and just like the Messiah who equals 424. But, the point I was getting at, that Wake the Fuck Up Radio that equaled 418, it came out 4 months and 18 days before Zach's birthday. It's last year. 4 months and 18 days before his birthday. And don't forget that Zach just became a father last year on November 16th. And that was all linked up to the Pope with composite numbers. Look at Pope Francis here. Pope Francis. His name in the composite cipher equals 209. And Pope Francis just ended up dying 209 days before his daughter's birthday. And it's for sure important to hit Zach too, because there's no one on the planet that believes everything is the Jesuits, and Pope Francis is all connected to it more than he does. There's no one else on the planet that talks about the Jesuits and Pope Francis as much as Zach does. So it's absolutely fitting that all these things would link up to him. But let's move on. I want to go back and explain the reason why I am talking about this, because you might be a little bit confused as to what I am talking about, and I feel like if I go back and explain the theme a little bit better and the history of why I think composite numbers are important and why it's connected to Aleister Crowley, what I just said will make a lot more sense. And once again, please bear with me. It is a lot to cover and a lot to re-explain, and it is very, very detailed. There's a lot of things that are going on with this that, my brain is about ready to explode, but yet at the end of the day, it all goes back and connects to each other. It's just the craziest thing. But if you go back to February of 2024, there was this big dream theme that I was talking about, and that related to my father as well. But I had this dream on February 3rd of 2024 that I was playing this game called Hypernova on Chumba, and I hit all number 9s. And I had all these synchronicities with number 9 in between that time period. And then 9 days later, I ended up winning $10,000 on that exact slot machine that I had a dream about about getting all number nines. That dream was also on the date 2/3, right? Like 23, and the ninth prime number is 23. And I talked a whole bunch about like how Michael Jordan was on the dream team and he wore the number 9 and he wore the number 23, and a bunch of stuff with Michael Jordan and his father. Michael Jordan's father actually died, I think, 9 days after his birthday, I believe it was. Michael Jordan's father died 9 days after his birthday. Michael Jordan came out of retirement or announced that he was coming back, and then his first game back was 9 days later. A whole bunch of stuff with the number 9, but think about Michael Jordan and his father. And right around the same time, we had the death of Toby Keith. And that doesn't seem that interesting, but after Super Bowl 52, I had this blog post. This is the first time I ever blogged about Toby Keith, and it was a dream. I talked about a dream about my dad dying, my father dying, and how it was linked up to this bridge collapse that happened 9 days before. And basically what had happened was, when Super Bowl 52 came around, all year I was talking about how Super Bowl 52 was synced up to the stock market, and how Super Bowl 52 was linked up to the kneeling during the national anthem, and also to bridge symbolism, because it was in U.S. Bank Stadium. Think about that, the stock market. And Herbert Hoover was the president during the stock market crash, but Herbert Hoover was also the president to sign into Congress to make the Star-Spangled Banner the official national anthem. And that Super Bowl had a lot to do with Trump calling out the kneeling in the NFL. And think about all the kneeling and how it related to Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the national anthem. And Francis Scott Key's birthday was August 1st, which was the same day in history there was a famous bridge collapse that happened in Minnesota. And that bridge fell 81 feet, and the main trusses were 81 meters long. And the story said it took them 81 minutes to transport everyone to the hospital. And once again, it was on the date 8/1. And back then I pointed out how Pope Francis had just turned 81 years old, and he's the first Jesuit pope, and his birthday was 81 days after the Jesuit anniversary. And the word pontiff actually means bridge builder, right? Pontiff means bridge builder. So there was this big narrative that was somehow interrelated to bridges and a stock market crash. And then we got this bridge collapse on the Ides of March that year at the FIU College in Florida, right? So there was a bridge collapse that happened just after Super Bowl 52. And Enter the Stars just so happened to make this video called "We Dreamed This 9 Days Ago." And I was listening to that video, and he was talking about how he had a dream of a building collapse, and he was connecting it to this bridge collapse. And in that video, he went on to talk about how the only time he's ever had a prophetic dream was when his father died outside of this dream. And I thought that was interesting because he was saying that it was 9 days before this, and 9 days before this, I had a dream that my father died. So I thought that was interesting. And I was also having a bunch of syncs with Toby Keith around the time. And when I looked up Toby Keith, I saw that he was in this movie called Broken Bridges. So, think about this. The dream and 9 days and how it links up to the father symbolism. And then, like I said, I had a dream about winning with all number 9s. And then 9 days later, I hit a jackpot. And in between there, Toby Keith dies. So I know there's something important to this number 9. And there was a whole bunch of other synchronicities I had with the number 9. I never even really blogged about any of this, and Zenith of the Alpha told me that I should watch this movie called The Nines. Can't remember what the whole point was, but it was just so random. It had nothing to do with anything I was following. He didn't know about the number 9 thing. And he told me I should watch this movie, The Nines, with Ryan Reynolds. And I sat down to watch this movie, and I looked over, and there was 2 flashcards right next to my chair, and there was an upside down 6, the one that was face up. So it was a number 9. So I'm getting ready to watch the movie called The Nines, and I look over and I see a flashcard of the number 9 on the floor. And then I watch the movie, and the movie is basically like this guy's an angel, and in one part of the movie his name is Gabriel, and all the angels are like number 9s, right? God is 10 and they're number 9. And this was interesting because in 2022 I had this dream where the angel Gabriel showed me the numbers 6 and 4. And this card right here that was upside down, when I flipped it over, it was a number 4. And this is a number 6, right? It's actually, it looks like a 9 when I saw it, but really it's a number 6 and a number 4 that were right next to me. So I get ready to watch this movie. I watch it, and it's about an angel, and his name's Gabriel. And then I'm sitting next to a 6 and a 4. And I had a dream in 2022 about the angel Gabriel showing me the numbers 6 and 4. Which gets even deeper, because when I was in high school, I had a dream about a girl that I went to school with named Crystal. And I had a dream that her father died. I was like 16 years old. And the very next day, her and her family got in a car wreck, and her father died. And that's the only time, I mean, that was the craziest thing in my life. And I had a dream that her father died, and then he died the very next day in a car wreck, exactly how I had a dream about it. And what was so interesting about the date 3/6, I didn't know this until years later. So I had a dream about my own father dying 9 days before the FIU bridge collapse. It was on March 6th, 3/6. That just so happened to be my friend Crystal's birthday. It's like, what are the odds of that? That I had a dream about her dad dying, and then he died the very next day. And then years later, I have a dream about my own dad dying, and it ends up being on her birthday. And it also turns out that her mom is a psychic. I did not know this until like the year 2021, right after I released my book. I found out that her mom is a psychic. And I just always thought that was really weird that I had a dream about a psychic's husband dying, and then he died the next day. And even at the Super Bowl that year, so if you go back to that same year I had the dream with the angel Gabriel, I also had a synchronicity with the word absolutely with my sister, and we were going to go on a skiing trip, and then I ended up going to Sioux Falls instead because it was way too expensive, and I'm pretty sure it was going to be like $9,000, but I could be wrong on that, but whatever. It made me look up the band. I had a synchronicity with absolutely. My sister said absolutely, and then I got a notification on my phone from someone commenting that said absolutely. So I looked up the band 9 Days because they have that song called Absolutely. That's what it made me think of. And I was like, that's funny, 9 days. And then 9 days after that, there was a big bridge collapse in Pittsburgh, right? 9 days later, a bridge collapse, which once again reminded me of the father symbolism. But believe it or not, during the Super Bowl that year, so the day before I won, there was one of the Super Bowl commercials was of this band, 9 Days. The band 9 Days, and they had a thing about travel South Dakota. And I was like, what? What's going on? Because I ended up having changed my trip after that synchronicity, and we went to South Dakota. And now the band 9 Days, years later, is on a commercial during the Super Bowl, and it's about South Dakota, and they're not even a band from South Dakota. They don't really have any ties to South Dakota. So once again, I knew there was something important to 9 days. And then, once again, 9 days later, I had that, after having that dream, I won $10,000 on the same machine that I had a dream about. And before I go any further, a little bit off topic, but with Super Bowl 52 and the bridge symbolism, like I said, it had a lot to do with the kneeling during the national anthem symbolism too. The word kneel equaled 88, right? Colin Kaepernick equals 88. The Star Spangled Banner equals 88. It was played at U.S. Bank Stadium. That equals 88, right? And I pointed out before that Super Bowl even happened, Super Bowl 52, how it was going to fall during the 88th anniversary of the stock market crash and a whole bunch of stuff. How, Trump equals 88. Herbert Hoover has the HH initials, like H is the 8th letter, so it's like an 88. And, Hubert Humphrey, what the stadium used to be called, and a whole bunch of stuff. There's all to do with the number 88. So then over the summer, I noticed all the synchronicity stuff that was going on with Super Bowl 52, and I pointed out how Pope Francis was going to be turning 88 years old, and he was also really linked up to that Super Bowl. So it's interesting, now that Pope Francis dies at the age of 88, which I will explain that again here in a minute, but I just wanted to point out that Pope Francis was really linked up to that Super Bowl, which was another reason with this father symbolism and seeing all the Super Bowl 52 stuff over last summer. I thought that maybe there was something important to Pope Francis. I didn't know he was going to die, but it just seemed that there was something important to the father symbolism that was related to Pope Francis. And remember, Pope Francis was hospitalized on Valentine's Day, and right after Super Bowl 52, we got the Stoneman Douglas shooting on Valentine's Day that reminded us of the St. Valentine's Day massacre that happened in 1929, the same year that Vatican City was established, the same year as the stock market crash. And like I said, I'll leave some video links in the description. I talk about all of this in a bunch of these videos. Particularly this one, I talk about Super Bowl 52 a ton and re-explain all of these connections to Pope Francis and Valentine's Day. That's why I made a video right afterward about Chester Bennington, the guy in Lincoln Park and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre being in Lincoln Park, Chicago. And Chester Bennington died, just before Super Bowl 52. And we had the death of the Home Alone actor John Hurd, he had a connection to 88 right around the same time as Chester Bennington. And Donald Trump was in the second Home Alone movie. I think Home Alone equals 88 is what it is, right? But anyway, so, after I won that money on the one I had the dream about, I didn't make a video until, I believe, like March something. It was the night before. I posted the video the night before we got the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse, right? And just think about that. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the national anthem. And then a bridge collapse. All of these things that I was talking about in relation to Super Bowl 52 and this dream that I had about my father dying and the bridge collapse after Super Bowl 52, right? So I was like, what are the odds? There's a Francis Scott Key bridge collapse. And if you look up this bridge collapse, the boat that hit it was called the MV Dolly, and it was named after this artist named Salvador Dali. And if you look him up, a lot of his art had to do with doing things unconsciously, like through dreams. So he made all of his art through the images that he saw in dreams. And he even had a painting called something like the Bridge and the Dream. So I knew there was some type of theme that I was supposed to see with Super Bowl 52. I didn't quite get it at the time, but I knew there was something that was important to Super Bowl 52. And there was all these stories that just kept showing me stuff with the dream theme and Super Bowl 52. Even think about how, I saw the numbers 6 and 4 were next to me on the floor. And on 6-4, we got a story about the dream being accused of rape. And what else is interesting about 6-4 is the day the guy that I had a dream about who died, my friend Crystal's dad in high school, his birthday just so happened to be 6-4, So it's even more interesting, his birthday is 6-4. And there was a thing connected to Nelly as well in 2022. And Nelly had the song called Just a Dream, and I was watching for the date 6-4. And then on 6-4, one of the girls in Nelly's Hot in Here video ended up dying on June 4th. But, more of the story. Just want to show there's more stuff with the dreams. Then we got the death of Donald Sutherland. And if you go back to all the stuff I was following leading up to Super Bowl 52, there was this big theme and how it linked up to the Sutherland Springs church shooting. And I was talking about Kiefer Sutherland and Donald Sutherland and the movie Stand By Me. He's also in the movie JFK, and there was a big thing with Marilyn Manson releasing a video called Say 10, and he had a guy who looked like Donald Trump with his head blown off, like an assassination. And then we had RFK Jr. running for president, and then a month later we had the Donald Trump assassination attempt. So I kind of was thinking there's something important to Super Bowl 52. We even had Justin Timberlake getting arrested. And Justin Timberlake just so happened to be the halftime show of Super Bowl 52. And Justin Timberlake was perfect too because, Super Bowl 52, all about the kneeling during the national anthem. And remember when he did the Super Bowl with Janet Jackson and he showed Janet Jackson's boob? She was singing songs off her album called Rhythm Nation 1814, and that was in remembrance of the year Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. That's why she named the album that, because it had to do with 1814, the year Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. So then years later, Justin Timberlake does the halftime show again, right before all the kneeling during the national anthem is synced up to the Super Bowl. But even before Justin Timberlake got arrested, I noticed that a tray at work had the number 1814 on it. And I was even thinking about all that stuff with Justin Timberlake, the number 1814. Then, like, the next day, Justin Timberlake got arrested, and I was like, get out of here. Justin Timberlake gets arrested after I see this number 1814. So it just seemed there was all these things that were showing me Super Bowl 52. I talked about the Francis Scott Key Bridge and Super Bowl 52. I went on to talk about all these things that I talked about before Super Bowl 52 and how it linked up to Marilyn Manson and the Satan video and, a whole bunch of other things. But look at the Satan video. Then right after Donald Trump, the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, Marilyn Manson releases his first song in like 4 years. And Marilyn Manson's new album just so happened to come out on the anniversary of the JFK assassination, and it was called One Assassination Under God, and it releases on the anniversary of the JFK assassination, which I'll get to, but it's just like exactly what I was talking about happened all summer. I mean, what are the odds we get a Donald Trump assassination attempt after I'm talking about all the stuff that's linked up to the Satan video with the Donald Trump assassination attempt? It's just crazy. And in the mix of all this too, I was having a bunch of synchronicities with the Father symbolism. There was just all kinds of stuff with the Father symbolism. Like, one day I had the song Dang Me by Roger Miller in my head all day long, and I don't exactly know why. It's a really old song. That song was in my head all day long. And I had recently started watching Supernatural because it was my girlfriend's favorite show, and I always thought it kind of looked stupid. And it reminded me of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show, and so on. And Donald Sutherland had just died, so I was like, oh, maybe I'll just try to watch Supernatural. Maybe it gets better as it goes along or something. But anyway, moral of the story is that I had the song Dang Me by Roger Miller in my head all day. And I came home and I started watching Supernatural. It was an episode, I think, called Nightmare. And what's so funny of this episode is that Sam has a psychic vision of a guy named Roger Miller dying. And I was like, that's crazy. I've had Dang Me in my head all day long, and that Dang Me is by Roger Miller. And then I turn on Supernatural, and the one guy is having a psychic vision about a guy named Roger Miller dying. And I looked up Roger Miller in Gematria, and his name just so happens to equal 184. And if you write out Supernatural, it equals 184. And considering it was about a psychic vision, I was like, maybe it's connected to, the psychic and the dream guy, right? And the guy that I had a dream about who died, named Daniel Gall, his name equaled 184. And, the very next day, I think, is when I made the post about Donald Sutherland and Justin Timberlake and the number 1814. And then a few days later, I was on Facebook, and something brought up this post, or this group, about psychics, right? And think about how that guy's wife was a psychic and so on, or is a psychic. And I just randomly clicked on it, and it just so happened to be someone posting about the meaning of the number 1814. And I thought, that's so weird. I just talked about Justin Timberlake and the number 1814 and Super Bowl 52 and so on. And now someone's on the psychic website talking about the number 1814. And I looked up the number 1814 and it talked all about how it uses the energies of the numbers 1, 8, and 4, right? Once again, 184. And I was trying to figure out like how you could, I don't know, I couldn't figure out how to like become a part of this group and whatever else. And so like the number's 184, the significance of it, right? But I ended up just going to Yahoo and I typed in how to become a psychic or something like that. And the first thing that came up was a video of this lady, how to become a psychic medium. And I looked up this lady's name in Gematria, and it just so happened to equal 184. And, you know, I tried joining this lady's group and whatever. It will not let me join her group on Facebook either. I don't know what the problem is, but I thought maybe there was something I was supposed to go on this page and I was being guided to follow this lady and or learn something from this lady. But I've watched a bunch of videos and I'm really not learning anything from it. And then I can't even join her page or anything for some reason. And I don't know, I don't understand. So I just gave up on it. But it's still interesting that her name equaled 184. And I was led there through the number 1814. Then if you look up the, you know, it says that it's all about the energies of 1, 8, and 4. And I have the synchronicity with supernatural with 184 and psychic vision. And I had a dream about a psychic's husband dying and his name equals 184. And I'm just bringing this up because later this night, after I had the synchronicity with 1814, I turned on Supernatural again. I just, whatever, I was going to go to bed and I figured I would turn on Supernatural. And, well, if I could find it, maybe that's not the blog post. Yeah, it's this blog post. I just did it on my phone, so it's small, but I just turned on the next episode of Supernatural that I had got to, and it happened to be the beginning of season 2. It's called In My Time of Dying, and I didn't think anything of it, but would you believe that the whole episode is about how Sam and Dean's father dies? So the father dies right after I have all of this synchronicity with the psychic vision again, and I had a synchronicity with Supernatural that led me to that, and now the episode after finding this psychic, you know, the next episode is about a father dying. And then the next day or something after this, I found out that my dad was going on vacation and he was leaving on June 30th, right? My dad was going to go on vacation and my mom was actually staying in town. He was going with his brothers or something. And he was going to Wyoming for some wedding. But he left on June 30th. And June 30th just so happens to be the day that leaves 184 days in the year, right? And I was like, oh man, hopefully my dad doesn't die on this trip or whatever's going on with it, you know? But it was just interesting, you know? All these 184 sync to the father symbolism. My father's now going on vacation and he's leaving on the day, leaving 184 days in the year. But this day also stood out to me because this is the day that Father Howard, that I'm talking about when I was a kid, the priest who we joked who molested me my whole life, and then he got kicked out of the church for actually sexually assaulting kids or whatever. The day that the story came out of him was on the date 6/30 of 2014. So that came out on the day leaving 184 days in the year, which made me think it was something important to priests and possibly Pope Francis. And in relation to Father, in 2017, I was having a whole bunch of synchronicity with Father, and it all linked back to this big pattern with Father Howard. And after Father Howard left, we got a priest named Father Paul, and he was a Jesuit. I didn't know this until years later, but he was seriously the nicest priest. Like, he was probably the best priest that I feel like I ever had growing up as a kid, you know? Like, I didn't really go to church a whole lot when he was the priest. My parents kind of made me sometimes or this or that, but he was just like the nicest guy, like for real. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that all these Jesuits are so terrible when I think about that guy, one of the nicest guys in the world. But he was synced up to the Jesuits and he died in connection to the Jesuits. It's crazy, but I had this crazy synchronicity back in May of 2017 where, and it all had to do with child molesting priests. So my daughter was, I used to always put my daughter to bed, and she wanted to watch cartoons. She always laid upstairs with me, and she wanted to watch cartoons, and she wanted me to turn the channel to something else so she could fall asleep. And when I was looking through the guide, I saw that South Park was on, and I knew that she hated South Park. And I also knew that, South Park isn't really for little kids, right? But I turned it to South Park as a joke for a few seconds, and when I turned it there was an episode called Red Hot Catholic Love that was on. I had no idea what episode it was until I turned it there. Ah, crap. I had no idea what episode it was until I just turned it here as a joke for a split second. And I thought it was funny that it was an episode about Catholic priests molesting kids because I had it loaded up on my computer and everything, but then Claire had to go to bed. So I just was trying to wait for Claire to go to bed, and I was going to watch this movie called Spotlight that was about child molesting priests in Boston. And the only reason I was going to watch this was because like a week before, my friend had told me that Father Howard's name was listed at the end of this movie, which it's not. But I wanted to watch it to see if that was true. So I was getting ready to watch this movie called Spotlight about the 87 priests who molest kids in Boston. And my daughter has to go to bed, so I try to get my daughter to go to bed, and I joke and turn on South Park, and it turns out to be the episode about Catholic priests molesting kids, but it just so happened to be the 87th episode of South Park, and if you write out Red Hot Catholic Love, it also equals 87. Also, if you write out the word priest equals 87, right? So I was like, man, that's crazy. And even then, I watched that movie, and then I started making a blog post about this, and my friend Pam called me, and she called me exactly 87 minutes after I started making that blog post. Exactly, on the dot, 87 minutes. And her name just so happened to equal 87. I was like, well, that's crazy. I started making a blog post about the number 87 and my synchronicity, and then my friend Pam calls me 87 minutes on the dot later, and her name equals 87, just like priest, just like Red Hot Catholic Love, how it's the 87th episode, how Spotlight's about the 87 priests in Boston who molest kids. And I think Father Howard's name equals 87. Yeah, Howard Fitzgerald equaled 87. I mean, I was just mind blown. But in relation to the number 184 and the father symbolism, so Father Howard's sexual assault story came out on the day leaving 184 days in the year. If you write out my daughter's full name, it equals 184. And this episode of South Park came out on the 184th day of the year. And even further, in relation to priests and so on, Father Paul, who I'm talking about, the Jesuit priest of my town, after Father Howard, he ended up dying 184 days after the Jesuit anniversary. And at the time, I didn't know the Francis Bacon or the capital letter ciphers. I had no idea about them. I mean, I knew about them, but I didn't have any real reason to apply them. I didn't, I always like to have an explanation of why I'm using the ciphers. And there's a big old narrative of why I am using the capital letter ciphers. And it all stems back to 2019. I don't want to re-explain it, but if you write out Roman Catholic, it equals 184 in them ciphers. But back then, the big thing I noticed with the priest symbolism was that, like, every priest in my town was connected to the number 63. Like, Friendly Father Fred, one of the priests when I was real little, I looked him up. He died on the 63rd day of the year. Father Jim, his name equaled 63. Father Howard got kicked out of the church at the age of 63. And that story came out on 6/30. And Father Paul, the Jesuit priest here, he died at the age of 63. I think his name equals 63. And he died in a bathtub at the Jesuit residence of Creighton 6 months and 3 days after the Jesuit anniversary, right? So 6 months, 3 days at the age of 63. His name equals 63. All the priests that I can remember as kids, they all have this connection to the number 63. And my uncle, who was a 4th degree Knight of Columbus, had died earlier in the year, and he was age 63, and he died in connection to Aleister Crowley, and also to the numbers of the Knights of Columbus, and he also died on the exact same day that I got an express shipped letter with $300 in it, basically telling me to believe in God and, quit making videos. And it's the weirdest thing. I've said that forever, but, because of this, I really started thinking everything was the Jesuits and so on. Even though now I realize it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And, I'm going to make another video and explain some other things in relation to that. But, that's where my mindset was in 2017 because of a lot of this. And I pointed out how JFK died at the age of 63, or not age of 63. He died in 1963 after meeting the Pope. So I thought there was this big connection, which there really is. But just after I had all the synchronicity, right, with Father Fitzgerald and whatever, we got the crash of the USS Fitzgerald. And it was named after a guy who was born on August 7th, if I could find that here, William Charles Fitzgerald, or he died on August 7th, right, 87, like priest, and his wife was named Betty, and two houses down from where I grew up was a lady named Betty Fitzgerald, and just all kinds of stuff with it. But I guess the moral of the story is just that after going back and looking at that old post and seeing all the number 184 with that old father synchronicities, it just made me wonder if there was something to do with priests and Pope Francis, especially how Pope Francis was linked up to Super Bowl 52 in the bridge symbolism, and Pontiff means bridge builder. And we just had the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. So hopefully you get the gist of just the father symbolism and how I was kind of following this narrative that had to do with psychics and this dreams and how it relates to father. And if you backtrack, like I showed earlier in the video, just in the months leading up to when I had that dream in February and then I won $10,000, there was a big thing going on with Aleister Crowley. All of a sudden I started noticing all of these things that were linked up to Aleister Crowley. And it all stemmed back to when I made this video about Rambo being kicked off the Gematria effect episode on the Ides of March. And I pointed out how Rambo, it was linked up to Zach's radio show. And like I said, I pointed out how Rambo's first ever call on that radio show was on the date 4/18, which turned out to be Zach's father's birthday. And, before I even knew the connection to 4/18 with Aleister Crowley, I was talking about how when Rambo first called in, that was 94 days before Zach's birthday. 4/18 is 94 days before Zach's birthday. Zach's first Gematria effect episode was 9 months and 4 days, like 94, before Rambo's birthday. Rambo was kicked off that episode 9 months and 4 days after Rambo's birthday. If you write out Zach Hubbard, it equals 94. If you write out Seattle, Washington, it equals 94. That's where Zach lived when he first started sharing about Gematria on YouTube and such. And when Rambo got kicked off, it had a lot to do with this umbrella symbolism and him talking about Fritz Springmeier, and Fritz Springmeier equals 94. And there's a whole bunch. You can go watch that video. There's a lot of 94. Today Zach changing his name to Number Games instead of Gematria Effect News is even a span of 9 months and 4 days after his birthday. Just all kinds of things going on. But I made that video and I talked about Rambo's first episode being on that day. And then Zenith pointed out the connection that, when Zach predicted the death of Prince back in 2016, and it got a lot more exposure for the Gematria community. And he said he learned about Aleister Crowley, whatever, from Zach, so he looked up the connections to Zach's radio show with Aleister Crowley, and he noticed that it was Zach's first ever radio show episode was a span of 93 days after Prince's birthday, and it was also a span of 4 months and 18 days after Prince had died. And then, like I said, I talked about Aleister Crowley in the Book of the Law with 93 equals 418 on it, right? So there was this connection to Prince. And then, of course, later, when I started seeing all these things with 418, I was like, oh, Zach's father is born on 418. I'm following this father symbolism. And then, think about Prince once again. Prince dying on 421. Pope Francis just recently died on 421. Zach's, the final episode that even aired on the Truth Frequency Radio, where Zach's radio show originally was, the final one that aired on that website was on 124. And that just so happens to be 4 months and 18 days after his very first episode aired. 418. And then, like I said, he started Wake the Fuck Up Radio, right? Wake the Fuck Up Radio that equaled 418. And he started that 4 months and 18 days before his birthday. He even got his first sponsor that was like Monero Coffee that equaled 418. Wake the Fuck Up Radio also came out 93 days after the anniversary of Aleister Crowley dying, right? So, once again, 93. So, it's 93 days after Aleister Crowley's death anniversary and 4 months and 18 days before Zach's birthday, and the show equals 418. Think about 93 and 418. But I'm bringing this up because I also noticed a relationship to the dream that I had in high school about the guy dying and how it was connected to the number 418. The guy's wife who died, who was a psychic, her name in the satanic cipher, Debbie Gall, that's what her name was at the time, equaled 418. Once again, it's interesting with the satanic cipher because of Aleister Crowley, right? And he's the great beast 666, and it's related back to the number 418. So it's interesting. Her name would equal that in the satanic cipher. And even more interesting is the fact that her husband just so happened to die 4 months and 18 days after her birthday. And her birthday is also 2/22, which I'll get to later, because if you go back to that Joseph Aquaviva and Mark Passio post, 2/22 is humongous, and it's super connected to the composite ciphers and so on. But so this lady's name equaled 418. Her husband died 4 months and 18 days after her birthday. And in relation to psychics, there's another person that's linked up to this kind of, and it's too much to explain, but my cousin's girlfriend gave me the Sylvia Browne book back when I was probably like 19 or 20 or whatever it was. And Sylvia Browne's like a famous psychic from Kansas City, and she used to be on the Montel show, right? And she died 4 months and 18 days before or after Montel's birthday, right? So 418 and the psychic theme, and that psychic theme relates back to the father symbolism, and then Zach's father born on 418. You see where I'm going with this and how it's like somehow related to Aleister Crowley? Plus I was talking about 1814 and the number 184, and how when I had the psychic page come up, it talked about the 1814 was the energies of 1, 8, and 4, which is also 4, 1, and 8, the same energies. There's just a ton of, father things that were going on. Let me go back to 2024 here. At the beginning of July, I also had a crazy... So Michael J. Fox, there was a story about Michael J. Fox and how he performed at Glastonbury with Coldplay. And once again, in relation to the dream theme that relates to the psychic stuff that relates to my father, for years, since 2015, I have talked about this theme with dreams and how it's linked up to Kanye West and the band Slipknot, and Kanye West singing the Freddie Mercury song, Bohemian Rhapsody at Glastonbury, and there was this big thing with the VMAs and Freddy Krueger, and then the day of the VMAs, Wes Craven ended up dying, the guy known for the Freddy Krueger movies. And of course, Freddy Krueger synced up to the dreams, right? He's the ruler of the dream world and so on, right? He kills people with their dreams. I have a ton of videos on this. I'm not going to re-explain it, but Coldplay is interesting too, because Coldplay used to have this album called A Head Full of Dreams, and I talked about this album in relation to Obama and the number 9, because at the time, if Obama would have been assassinated, he would have been the ninth president to die in office, and a whole bunch of stuff. So once again, the number 9 in Dreams, and Michael J. Fox just went and played with Coldplay, that has this album called A Head Full of Dreams that relates back to the number 9 in Obama that I've talked about in like 2015, I believe it was. The same year I talked about the stuff with Kanye West and Glastonbury. So I thought this was interesting in relation to this narrative. And then, of course, I look up Michael J. Fox, and his name just so happens to equal 184. And that story came on the day leaving 184 days in the year. And that links back to the dream and father symbolism that I am talking about. But what was even crazier is the song that he played with them was called Fix You. And if you go and look up the song Fix You, it talks about how the lead singer, I think it is, of Coldplay, or whatever member it is of Coldplay, Chris Martin, it says that he wrote the song to comfort his then wife, actress Gwyneth Paltrow, whom he met in the late 2002 after her father died. So the song was to comfort Gwyneth Paltrow after her father died. And then his name equals 184. The psychic father dream theme that I'm talking about, It's just like, what are the odds? But then, a week later, we got the Donald Trump assassination attempt. Let me find that here, but with the Donald Trump assassination attempt. And the Donald Trump assassination attempt came the same day that Shannon Doherty had died. And that was interesting because I was following, when I talked about Donald Sutherland, I talked about the Marilyn Manson video, Satan, and the, assassination of Donald Trump. And, Donald Sutherland is in Merrick and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And, we just had Michelle Trachtenberg die, all synced up to this Buffy the Vampire Slayer narrative that I'm talking about with the Donald Trump assassination attempt. But Shannon Doherty dying that day was interesting because she used to date Luke Perry on 90210. And this was right before right around the same time Beverly Hills Cop came out with another movie and so on. Think about Beverly Hills 90210 and so on. But Shannon Doherty died this same day, but Luke Perry died on 310. And 310 was this big number I was talking about with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And a narrative, Buffy the Vampire Slayer equals 310. And what's interesting is that whole narrative, I'm not going to re-explain it, but it all began with the story that I saw on November 22nd of 2018, and Buffy wearing sexy lingerie. But notice that is the anniversary of the JFK assassination, and 3 months and 10 days later, Luke Perry died. Luke Perry died 3 months and 10 days later. He didn't die on 310. But there was a whole bunch of stuff with 310 that year, but Luke Perry died 3 months and 10 days after noticing this pattern with the number 310 and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And the date 310 was interesting too, because my dad's father, my grandpa, he ended up dying on 3/10/2020. And that post where I was talking about Spotlight and Priests years ago, and I noticed all them 63s, I thought that maybe my dad's father would die when my dad was 63 years old. And then my grandpa ended up dying 1 month before my dad turned 63 years old, and he died on the date 3/10. So I've always associated that day with father symbolism. And even more interesting is, when I found out about the Donald Trump assassination attempt, I was in a car ride. I was with my kids and my grandma and my mom and dad, and we were going to my brother's house for a birthday party. And I found out about the Donald Trump assassination attempt at the exact spot where the guy who I dreamed died. So the psychic's husband, who I had a dream about in high school, the spot where he wrecked in a car and died is the exact spot where I found out about the Donald Trump assassination attempt. My kid had my phone and my mom was looking at hers, and all of a sudden my mom said, "Donald Trump got shot," or whatever. And then we were all looking at the news story, and it was at the exact spot where this guy died from my dream. And something I always pointed out that was interesting about right next to where he died was out on the train tracks, there's these fence posts that look like the 9 Inch Nails logo. So once again, the number 9. And I knew somehow this assassination attempt was synced up to the father symbolism. And then, of course, you have RFK Jr. running for president, and then Donald Trump gets the assassination attempt. It reminds me of JFK. And once again, JFK was linked to the number 63 that reminded me of the father symbolism. JFK also ended up being assassinated after meeting the Pope, which I can only make 15-minute sections here, but I just decided to look up how far away it was again. I noticed JFK died 4 months and 21 days after meeting the Pope, just like how Pope Francis ended up dying on 4/21. But so the Donald Trump assassination attempt, you knew it was probably linked to Pope Francis because of that, and along with the father symbolism. But this happened 157 days before his birthday and 209 days after his birthday. And the shooter, they said, was born on September 20th, which in other countries they rated as 20/9, a lot like the number 209. And if you read out his name, Thomas Crooks, it equals 209. And if you read out John F. Kennedy, it equals 209. And a little bit later, when I started realizing the importance to the composite numbers with all this, I noticed if you read out Pope Francis equals 209 in the composite cipher. I also promised that I will bring this all back together and explain why the composite ciphers make sense here in a minute, but, it's just interesting. Pope Francis, 209, all these other 209s, John F. Kennedy, 209. And in relation to, JFK meeting the Pope, then dying, remember Pope Francis and Donald Trump met on the date 5/24/2017, and on that same day, Iowa Governor Terry Branstad stepped down to become the ambassador to China, and Kim Reynolds became the governor of Iowa the very same day that Donald Trump first met Pope Francis. And there's more to this too, the first Slipknot member to die was Paul Gray, and he died on that date as well in history. And he's, Slipknot's from Iowa. Herbert Hoover, the only president that was born in Iowa. There was this big narrative that I followed, right? But then fast forward to 2021, and the first time that Joe Biden ever met Pope Francis as the president was on 10/29/2021, which just so happened to be the anniversary of the stock market crash. And this very same day, another headline story in the news was how the Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds had did something for coronavirus. Can't remember what it was exactly. But Kim Reynolds, the Iowa governor, was a headline story the same day that Joe Biden met Pope Francis for the first time being the president. And they met each other, like Donald Trump met the Pope 4 years, 5 months, and 6 days before Joe Biden met the Pope on the anniversary of the stock market crash. And this was interesting because we had just had Squid Game that came out, and Squid Game was all about the number 456. The main character's name equals 456, the number 456, whatever it is, 45.6 billion won or whatever it is that they win. But it's all about money and the piggy bank. Of course, Paul Gray of Slipknot was known as the Pig. Pig refers to money, raking in the bacon, and Iowa is the leading producer of pigs. China, I think, is the world's leading producer of pigs, and Terry Branstad stepped down to go be the ambassador to China. That's why Kim Reynolds became the governor. But it seemed that these two meetings were linked up to Squid Game and this theme with money, especially when Joe Biden did it on the anniversary of the stock market crash. And all these connections to Iowa, and Herbert Hoover, the only president from Iowa, and was the president during the stock market crash. And, Kamala Harris was the vice president, and Kamala Harris was born the exact same day in history that Herbert Hoover died. Herbert Hoover died on October 20th, 1964, the same day that Kamala Harris was born. So I knew there was a narrative going on with the stock market and how it linked up to Kamala and Donald Trump and Joe Biden meeting the Pope. And once again, in relation to these composite ciphers, look at Herbert Hoover's full name. Herbert Clark Hoover. Well, did I spell it wrong? I did. I forgot an R there. Herbert Clark Hoover, and the composite ciphers just so happens to equal 456. And then think how they released the new Squid Game just before Donald Trump becomes the president again. And now, almost every single day, the stories in the news are all about the stock market and the stocks and so on, right? So, to me, there's just no doubt that Squid Game was linked up to the stock market narrative. So considering I was noticing all these things that seemed to be linked to Super Bowl 52 that I talked about related to the stock market crash, and then there's all this stuff with JFK going on that's related back to the father symbolism, then the Donald Trump assassination attempt happens at the exact same spot, or I find out about it at the exact same spot where this guy had a dream died, and it was connected to the father symbolism. I wondered how far away the Donald Trump assassination attempt was to the stock market crash, right? And when I looked that up, I noticed it was 3 months and 16 days. And this stood out right away because for years, I've talked about this number in relation to the stock market with Donald Trump and Herbert Hoover. Notice Herbert Hoover in these capital letter ciphers equals 316. Also, if we write out Donald Trump also equals 316. A lot like 3 months and 16 days before the stock market crash anniversary. Further, Joe Biden ended up dropping out of the presidential race, right? On July 21st. That just so happened to be a span of 3 months and 16 days before the election. And even more interesting is that if you go from the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, it was, well, let's see here. It was 456 days before Kamala Harris's birthday. So if you go from the day Joe Biden dropped out of the race and you go forward 456 days, it takes you to Kamala Harris's birthday. And there's a whole bunch of other connections. If you go from the date 316, like 316, and you go forward 456 days, it took you to Donald Trump's birthday. If you went 456 days after the day Squid Game came out in 2021, it took you to Pope Francis's birthday, right? So there's this big narrative with Squid Game and somehow how it's related to the stock market. And to keep on the stock market narrative, once again, Kamala, born the same day as Herbert Hoover, or died and so on. If you go to Super Bowl 52 from Kamala Harris's birthday, it just so happens to be a span of 3 months and 16 days. So her birthday was 3 months and 16 days before Super Bowl 52, reminding us of the number 316. And then you look at Pope Francis. If you go from Super Bowl 52 and you go to Pope Francis's birthday, it just so happens to be 316 days. So his birthday was 316 days after Super Bowl 52. And if you go from Pope Francis's birthday to the anniversary of the stock market crash, it also is 316 days. So there was a definite narrative with how this Donald Trump assassination attempt was linked up to the stock market narrative, and then Joe Biden dropping out of the race linked up to the number 316, linked up to the number 456 with Kamala, which goes back to Donald Trump and Joe Biden meeting the Pope. It all had to do with the Pope, so the father symbolism. And then think about how Pope Francis was hospitalized on Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day just so happens to be 3 months and 16 days after the stock market crash anniversary. And once again, right after Super Bowl 52, the next day the headline story was Market Meltdown. And then we had the Stoneman Douglas shooting, which the mascot was the Eagle, right after the Eagles won the Super Bowl 52. But that was on Valentine's Day, reminded us of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that happened in 1929, the same year Vatican City was established, the same year that the stock market crash happened. And to take it further, Stoneman Douglas was in Parkland, Florida. JFK died in Parkland Hospital right? So there's this big narrative with popes and the president all linked up to the stock market. Even the first day after I had originally blogged about all this stuff with the stock market and the number 316, I went to work and I had to go out to the shed to take like a road cone out to the shed. And I walked out of the shed and there was a truck parked there and it said stock market on the side. And I was like, what are the odds? I'm blogging about the stock market in 316 with Donald Trump's assassination attempt. And now there's a truck that has, in big lettering, stock market on the side. And the company was Sullivan Supply. And if you read out Sullivan Supply, it equaled 316. So this synchronicity was even telling me I was on the right track with this narrative with the stock market and how it's linked to the Pope and so on. But then it just kept getting crazier and crazier. Donald Trump announced that J.D. Vance would be his vice presidential candidate. And J.D. Vance, look at his birthday, August 2nd. You go from August 2nd to Donald Trump's birthday, 316 days. So he chose J.D. Vance, a guy who was born 316 days before his birthday. Donald Trump's wife, Melania, her birthday just so happens to be 316 days after Donald Trump's birthday. What's her birthday? Isn't it 4/26? Pretty sure. Let me look it up really quick. Melania Trump. 4/26. So if you go from Donald Trump's birthday and go forward 316 days, it takes you to his wife's birthday. Then he chooses a guy. If you go from his birthday and you go forward 316 days, it takes you to Donald Trump's birthday. And in relation to the father symbolism, if you look up Donald Trump's father, wherever I put this, his father was born on October 11th and died on June 25th, which means that he died 3 months and 16 days before his birthday. So Donald Trump's father even died in connection to this number 316. And of course, his second assassination attempt was on September 15th, which was a whole slew of things here. Maybe I'll talk about it later, but September 15th leaves 3 months and 16 days in the year. And the guy who tried to assassinate him, supposedly Ryan Ruth, his name equals 418. Then you had Kamala Harris. She chose Tim Walz, right, for her vice president candidate. And it came down to Tim Walz and Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro. Notice how he equals 316. So it came down to him and Tim Walz, the former governor of Minnesota. Remember, Super Bowl 52 was played in Minnesota, and it was won by Philadelphia. And she picked Tim Walz in Philadelphia, the governor of Minnesota. You know, what are the odds of that? And then the other guy that it was going up against was Josh Shapiro, who equals 316. And then once again, when they announced this, they showed a football picture with Tim Walz, right? And I think it's the Minnesota Vikings even in this picture, right? Think about that. Once again, telling you about Super Bowl 52. Super Bowl 52, like I said, was linked up to the stock market narrative and linked up to Pope Francis. Then you had like Marilyn Manson releasing his first single since the year 2020, and he just so happened to release it on J.D. Vance's birthday. He releases this new single on J.D. Vance's birthday, so 316 days before Trump's birthday. And once again, he had the Say 10 video with it looked like Donald Trump being assassinated. If you write out Marilyn Manson's real name, it's Brian Hugh Warner. That equals 316. And there's a whole lot more to this too, because in 2017, before Marilyn Manson released that video of what looked like Donald Trump being assassinated on the Say 10 video, Marilyn Manson's father actually died before that year, right before that album released, right? So Marilyn Manson's father died. And even more interesting is there's an interview where Marilyn Manson says before he was born, his father was training to be a Jesuit priest, like Pope Francis. And remember, he released that video just before Super Bowl 52. Marilyn Manson also added a woman to the band for the first time ever named Reba Myers. And Reba Myers equals 316 in Gematria. So, no doubt that I was on the right track of what I was talking about with all this stuff. Another interesting thing in relation to what I was talking about, the number 418, right? So this 316 is really, really big, right? With the Donald Trump assassination attempt. And it's all kind of related back to this symbolism that I have talked about. And the song Say 10 that has the Donald Trump assassination attempt, or, it looks like Donald Trump being assassinated in the original video. But notice it's 4 minutes and 18 seconds in length. 418. And once again, that's the number that seems to be important to Aleister Crowley. And Zenith of the Alpha of America was pointing out to me how the Donald Trump assassination attempt had all these connections to Aleister Crowley, such as how the assassination attempt was 4 months and 18 days before the death day of Aleister Crowley. And it was also a span of 337 days before Donald Trump's next birthday. A span here. 337. And the 337th composite number just so happens to be 418. I'll show you really quick. 337. So the 337th composite is 418. I also saw stuff like, if you read out Joe Biden's full name, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., in the composite cipher, it equals 418. So then I wondered what Aleister Crowley equaled, right? Aleister Crowley. And look, he just so happens to equal 316 in the composite cipher. So, I'm talking about Donald Trump, the stock market, all these 316s. Now, Zenith is showing me the connections to Aleister Crowley's death and so on, with 418 and Donald Trump. And I see that Aleister Crowley equals 316 in the composite cipher. And this stood out even more because when you look up Aleister Crowley, if you go from his death day to the day of his birthday, it's a span of 316 days. So in the composite cipher, Aleister Crowley equals 316. He died 316 days after his birthday. Then you think about all these other 316s. It seemed that there was something linked to the Donald Trump assassination attempt and these two numbers, 316, 418, and how it relates to Aleister Crowley. And, honestly, I don't like using new ciphers. There's a ton of ciphers. There's a lot of times people overdo the ciphers and they don't have any real reason of why they're using them. And that's why I'm trying to make this very detailed, because this is a specific reason of why I thought we should follow the composite ciphers, because it's linked up to Aleister Crowley, this big narrative that I had been following, for the last year or so. I just think that it makes more sense when you can actually explain the reason why you're using a cipher. You know what I mean? There has to be a real reason why. Because otherwise, you can make anything fit to anything. Like the Francis Bacon ciphers. There's a lot more to it, but in 2019, it was the Chinese pig year, and they're not even called Francis Bacon ciphers, the capital letter ones. There's a whole nother story to this, but the reason I started following it began with how it was a Chinese pig year, and I was thinking about Francis Bacon and pigs, and it goes back to Jeopardy and a bunch of other things. But there was an actual narrative of why I was being led to start following them ciphers, and they've synced up to everything ever since. It's been absolutely revealing and important, but I try to have a reason why I'm talking about a certain thing. And Aleister Crowley is the reason why these composite ciphers seem to make sense. And the reason why gets even deeper, because if you go back to when we first learned, this person called in about if we'd ever use the composite numbers, because we always talk about the prime numbers, if there's any connection to composite numbers, and that's when we started looking at it. And if you go from the day that that guy called in to the Donald Trump assassination attempt, it just so happens to be 4 months and 18 days. And further, if you go from this date and you go forward 418 days, it takes you to the date 4/18 of 2025. But after I learned this, then we remember how we got the story on the beginning of August. There was a story about the market melting, right? There was a story about the market melting down. Global stocks are plunging. Markets are melting down. And once again, right after Super Bowl 52, the next day, the headline story was markets are melting down. So we had these other stories that would say the markets are melting right after the Donald Trump assassination attempt. And it was on August 5th of 2024. And if you go from Donald Trump's birthday and you go forward 418 days, it takes you to this day. So 418. Sync to this big story with the markets are melting before Donald Trump even becomes the president again. So once again, these numbers seem to be related, 316 and 418, and they seem to be connected to Aleister Crowley. And then I started noticing other things, in relation to Donald Trump meeting Pope Francis. Donald Trump met Pope Francis in 2017, 4 months and 18 days before the birthday of Aleister Crowley. And in relation to capital letters and the capital letter ciphers, if you went from the capital insurrection, right, the capital insurrection to the day that Donald Trump met Pope Francis, if I can get it here, it also just so happens to be 4 months and 18 days. Also 138 days, like if you read out Donald Trump in the regular letters, the alphabetic order, it equals 138. But another big thing was that on the same trip that Donald Trump met Pope Francis, that's the trip where he touched the Western Wall. And remember how that was connected to capital letters, right? Touching the Western Wall, and if you read out Donald Trump in all capital letters, it equals 424, and the Hebrew lettering of Donald Trump equals 424, and there's an interview where these Jewish rabbis were talking about how Donald Trump was the savior of Ukraine because of his name equaling the same as some form of Messiah in the Hebrew lettering. And then Donald Trump touched the Western Wall at 424. So there's this big, all kinds of stuff. His wife died 4 months and 24 days after her birthday. All kinds of things with 424 and Donald Trump. But a lot of it had to do with him being the savior of Ukraine in relation to capital letters. And I'm bringing this up because Russia invaded Ukraine 418 days. If you go from Vladimir Putin's birthday and then go forward, 4 months and 18 days, not 418 days. 4 months and 18 days after Vladimir Putin's birthday is the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. So 418 even connects to that. And if you go from the day that Donald Trump touched the Western Wall to the date that his assassination attempt was on, if you go forward 418 days, it takes you to that date, 7/13. So he touched the Western Wall on May 22nd. You go forward 418 days, it takes you to July 13th, the day that he had the assassination attempt in history. So hopefully you understand how all of these narratives kind of connect together and why I think the composite numbers seem to be so significant and how it's related to Aleister Crowley and how it's related to the stock market and how it's related to the father symbolism and Donald Trump's assassination attempt. It's this big detailed thing of how they all seem to be interrelated, And this big number 418, think about how that's Zachary K. Hubbard's father's birthday. And go back to what I said. When I first started learning about 418 and Aleister Crowley, it had to do with Zenith of the Alpha talking about Prince, the singer, and Prince died on 421, which was the same day that Pope Francis would later go die on, which is also Queen Elizabeth's birthday. And Queen Elizabeth died on September 8th, which just happens to be Zach's mother's birthday. And if you go from 421 to 9/8, it is 4 months and 18 days, right? 418. So it's interesting. Pope Francis dies 4 months and 18 days before Zach's mother's birthday. His father's born on 4/18, which is 4 months and 21 days before Zach's mother's birthday. And even better yet, if you go from Zach's mother's birthday to the day that Zach was born, look at this, 316 days. So Zach was born 316 days after his mom's birthday, and his dad's birthday is 4/18. And remember, Zach had the prediction that Joe Biden would die on June 1st, or maybe it wasn't die, but he would leave office at least on June 1st, 2024. Just so happens to be 316 days after Zach's birthday. And then what happened? Joe Biden ended up leaving office or stepping down from the election on Zach's birthday, 7/21 of 2024, 3 months and 16 days before the election. You can't even make this stuff up. He has a prediction that he's going to leave office or die on June 1st, 316 days after his birthday. And then Joe Biden ends up stepping down from the election on Zach's birthday, 3 months and 16 days before the election. And once again, and Joe Biden's full name equals 418 in the composite ciphers. Zach's father born on 4/18. He's born 316 days after his mother's birthday. I mean, the Pope dies 4 months and 18 days before his mother's birthday. You can't even make this stuff up. And shortly after the Donald Trump assassination attempt, there was even a story in the news about Prince and Purple Rain. And I only saw it because I went to Zach's blog post, but there was this story about Prince and the 40th anniversary of Purple Rain on July 27th. And Zach did a blog post on it. But would you believe that Purple Rain came out 316 days before Prince's birthday? 316 days before Prince's birthday. And this also means that it came out 4 months and 21 days before Pope Francis's birthday. A span of 4 months, 21 days. Look at this. So 316 days before Prince's birthday, and then 4 months and 21 days before Pope Francis's birthday. Prince died on 4/21. Pope Francis ends up dying on 4/21. I learned about Aleister Crowley, linked up to that, from Zena's comment about Zach and 4/18 and the composite numbers. It's insane. Even right after this Prince story, Zach had a synchronicity with Amish, and he made this video called The Amish Paradise. And, he never really looked that much into it, but I was like, I'm going to check it out. I'm going to check out his synchronicity, especially since he wrote The Amish Paradise. And once again, my first concert ever was Weird Al. I've been Weird Al for Halloween. Always loved Weird Al. And, anyway, so I looked up the song and all that. And the song came out 4 months and 18 days. What was it? The song came out 4 months and 18 days before Weird Al's birthday, I think it is. It happened 4 months and 18 days after Amish Paradise was released. And the song was released 4 months and 18 days after Weird Al's birthday. So his synchronicity was synced up to 4/18 with Amish Paradise being released. And Amish Paradise released 4 months, 18 days after Weird Al's birthday. And, there's a whole bunch more, the song came out 7 months and 11 days after Coolio's birthday. And 711's this number I've followed with Aleister Crowley in the reverse primes, because my name equals 711 in reverse primes, Aleister Crowley equals 711. In reverse primes, AWAS has a connection to 711. The word magic, the way Aleister Crowley spells it, equals 4/18 in the reverse prime, so I feel like it's a cipher that is somehow important to Aleister Crowley, but once again, and Zach's daughter was born in relation to Aleister Crowley in the composite ciphers that I'll talk about later. But remember, my son is named Aleister. His birthday is 316 days after Kamala Harris's birthday, and my sons are born 4 months and 18 days apart. And I'm just bringing that up because there's always been, since 2017 when I was talking about that priest synchronicity, before that I was talking all about the angel Gabriel, and I had all the synchronicity with the angel Gabriel in Daniel 10:12. And it talked about how the angel Gabriel came to Daniel and told him that he was going to give him understanding and such. And, you know, like my grandpa, my mom's father, was born on this day. And that's the day that Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered America. And like I said, I was learning I had all this synchronicity with that around the time of my uncle dying that had to do with him giving me this Dan Marino jersey. And there's a big narrative here, but the second Donald Trump assassination attempt was on Dan Marino's birthday. And Dan Marino's father just so happened to die 3 months and 16 days after his birthday. But for years, I've been talking about this connection to me and Zach with the angel Gabriel, and how the angel Gabriel only goes to Daniel, Zechariah, and Mary in the Bible, right? And he tells Zechariah that he's going to birth, or that his son is going to be John the Baptist, and he tells Mary she's going to birth Jesus, and then he tells Daniel about his dreams and visions. And it's like, what are the odds of that? I'm having all these dreams that are super linked up to all these things going on. I mean, I'm having like prophetic dreams. And then now Zach becomes a father, and the father symbolism I've said it all seems like a lot of it is synced to 624, and that's the day of the feast day of John the Baptist. I mean, and remember, a lot of that had to do with the umbrella symbolism. There's so much to explain. The lady Mary Toffelmeyer calling into Zach's radio show, which, go back to that Rambo video where I'm talking about the umbrella symbolism and mind control. There's something going on with it, with Zach becoming a father now, and then my two kids are born 4 months and 18 days apart. You know, Aleister Crowley's birthday is 10/12, and I had all that synchronicity with Daniel 10:12. Oh, further, if you write out Angel Gabriel, that's something I didn't point out earlier. Angel Gabriel equals 184. Like that number connected to the dreams, right? And the father symbolism. So anyway, hopefully you understand why I was saying I think the composite numbers are important, why I think Aleister Crowley is important, why this number 418 seems important, why the father symbolism seems important. And then, you go to September and Zach makes these random videos about Mark Passio's father dying and about Joseph Aquaviva's father dying. And remember, when we first learned about composite numbers, it was in a video about Joseph Aquaviva 4 months and 18 days before the Donald Trump assassination attempt. And if you read out Joseph Aquaviva's name, Joseph Aquaviva, or it's Vincent. Joseph Vincent Aquaviva. His name equals 337, which once again, the 337th composite is 418. And if you write out Zach's full name, Zachary Keith Hubbard, it also has a connection to 337, which once again is the 418 is the 337th composite number. And even more odd is the day that Zach put out these videos, I had a DJ gig in Dow City, Iowa. And after I DJ'd, I had to go straight to Des Moines because I had a band gig that night for a wedding. So, I listened, it's like a 2-hour drive to Des Moines from Dow City, or roughly 2 hours, not quite 2 hours, but so I started listening to these videos on the way there just to kill time. I don't really listen to the radio anymore. Moral of the story, I listened to these videos on the way there, and we were drinking whatever. We didn't want to drive all the way home. So we ended up, my friend Pat got a hotel And we just so happened to stay in room 337. And I was like, get out of here. Listen to this stuff about Joseph Aquaviva and Mark Passio's fathers, and then talk about 418, and then all of a sudden I'm staying at this number connected to 418. And even funnier, the hotel was called the Hyatt Place, that equals 316. And also 666 in Sumerian, but 316. I mean, you just can't even make it up. Also, too, in relation to fathers, on this drive up to Des Moines, the fuel pump went out in my Blazer, so I didn't have a car to do this. So I had to borrow my dad's truck, right? So I was driving in my dad's truck while I'm listening to these videos about, these fathers dying. And my dad's license plate even has the number 624 on it. That's part of the reason why I was following the date 624 with the father symbolism. Had a whole lot of stuff to do with drowning and whatever, but my father can't swim, but I noticed that his license plate said 624 on it. Around the same time I went to this bar, I was following this drowning theme, and I went to the bar, and I think the bar equaled 624, and this girl came up to me at the bar that night and told my friend that I saved her brother from drowning, which I really did, but that girl's father had just died in the months before. So there's this father symbolism. It's so weird that I'm driving my dad's truck, and then all of a sudden I'm listening to these videos on the way to Des Moines, and I stay in the hotel room 337 at a place that equals 316. And even more funny is, on the way there, I stopped in Manning, Iowa at a Casey's, because it was really hot out that day, and I'd been outside all day DJing, and I wanted to get a water and something to eat. And when I went in, I was standing behind a guy wearing a jersey that had the number 58 on it, and the name said Pops. And I was like, that's pretty funny. The name Pops, and some people call their father Pops, and I'm listening to these videos on the way to Des Moines. And then later I was looking at Mark Passio's father's obituary, and he died on May 8th, 5/8. And if you read the obituary, it talks about how they called him Pops. And I'm like, what are the odds of that, I look at a guy, he's wearing a jersey in front of me. His name says Pops, and he's wearing the number 58 jersey. And then Mark Passio's father's, they call him Pops, and he died on 5/8. But, since it was so random, and Zach makes these videos about the two fathers dying, and then I knew his father was born on 4/18, and I'm following this big narrative, I was like, I wonder, if there's something connected. And I noticed that Zach's father was born 4 months and 28 days, or 4 months and 21 days before his mother, 4/21. And in the composite cipher, if you write out Zach's father's name, Timothy Stephen Hubbard, it equals 421. And I was like, that's crazy. So his mom and dad are born 4 months and 21 days apart, and I'm following these composite ciphers, and his dad equals 421, and it's related to Aleister Crowley. And then once again, if you write out Zachary Keith Hubbard, his name has a connection to 421 in the capital letter ciphers. His name also had that connection to 418 with this 337 in the composite cipher. And then I started thinking about how I learned about 418 in relation to Zach and Prince, and Prince died on the date 4/21. And Prince died on Queen Elizabeth's birthday, and Queen Elizabeth died on Zach's mother's birthday, right? It's crazy. And Queen Elizabeth died 4 months and 18 days after her birthday. And then once again, you go back and look at how Zach was born 316 days after his mom's birthday. These two numbers, 316 and 418, are, it's absolutely related to the Pope dying. It's insane. Further, Zach made these videos 4 months and 21 days after my father's birthday. 421, again. And if you write out Mark Passio in the Jewish cipher, I don't know how that actually relates to what I'm talking about as far as ciphers, but I just thought that was interesting that there was a cipher where Mark Passio equals 421. Also, if you look at Mark Passio's father, his birthday was 418 days before Zach's birthday. If you go forward 418 days from his birthday, it takes you to Zach's birthday. And Mark Passio's father shared a birthday with JFK. It goes back to that Trump assassination stuff. I'm trying to think. His father also died in connection to the Pope. Hold on. I know his father died like 4 months and 21 days before Pope Francis's birthday. I don't know why I put that in here. Maybe I didn't write that in here, but I'll just pull it up over here. His father, if you go from Pope Francis's birthday to the day of his father dying, it was 4 months and 21 days, right? 421. So Mark Passio's father died 4 months and 21 days after Pope Francis's birthday. I mean, you can't even make this stuff up. 421, then Pope Francis dies on 421. And in relation to Zach, too, Zach made these videos. Let's see here. Zach made these videos 3 months and 16 days before Pope Francis's birthday. 316. Once again, these same numbers that I'm talking about. And then think about how JFK died 4 months, 21 days after meeting the Pope, and how Mark Passio's father shared a birthday with JFK. And my father, his birthday is 4/11, right? Like how JFK died on 4/11 Elm Street. Think about Elm Street. Think about Freddy Krueger. Think about the Dream theme. Think about my father in relation to the whole theme with dreams and how it relates to the father symbolism. And I even pointed out how there was that big connection to 10 days before in here. Remember, 10 days before was a big old thing with JFK and the assassination. And look at that. 10 days before is 421. So then Pope Francis ends up dying 10 days. You know, my dad's birthday was 10 days before Pope Francis died. It's just unbelievable. And then as you get further in here, look, Joseph Aquaviva's father, his birthday was February 4th. That means his birthday was the same day as Super Bowl 52. It's like, no way. His birthday was same day as Super Bowl 52. If you read about Mark Passio's father, in his obituary, it talks about how he was formerly of Philadelphia, the team who won Super Bowl 52. And then think about how the Eagles went on to win the Super Bowl after all this happened, right? The Eagles went on to win the Super Bowl, all connected to Super Bowl 52. That was connected to the number 88 and Pope Francis and the stock market. You got all these stock market stories in the news. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's unbelievable. Pope Francis dies age 88. Mark Passio, he's even a former member of the Church of Satan. And look up Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey, the former leader of the Church of Satan. Look what his birthday is. The same day as my dad's. Look when he died. The anniversary of the stock market crash. It's unbelievable, you know? And he died in, the Church of Satan is in San Francisco. He died in San Francisco. The Super Bowl, this upcoming Super Bowl, is going to be in San Francisco. San Francisco is named after St. Francis of Assisi, who Pope Francis also got his name from. And look at Anton LaVey's full name here, or whatever he changed it to. Look at this in Gematria. His name equals 337. The connection to 418. And also it's 233. And remember, this videos that Zach put out was 233 days before Pope Francis died. And Joseph Aquaviva's father died on the 233rd day of the year. And we learned about composite numbers 296 days before Pope Francis's birthday. And 296 is the 233rd composite number. Also remember that Zach was in San Francisco on 4/18 of the year 2023, and 4/18 is the day of the great San Francisco earthquake and fire. So There is a huge narrative here. The number 233 also reminds me of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, and think about the Golden Gate Bridge that's in San Francisco. Like I said, the first number that I was really looking at with composite ciphers was 233. If you write out Francis Scott Key Bridge, it equals 233. And this bridge opened on 23/3. And if you write out Star Spangled Banner, it equals 296, which has that, 296 composite is 233. If you write out bridge, it equals 233. If you write out bridge maker, this is what Zenith of the Alpha was pointing out. Bridge maker, oh, it's in the Jewish cipher, the Latin cipher, that equals 233, but then, Francis Scott Key and Pope Francis. And then Pope Francis has that connection to, Pontiff means bridge builder. He had that big connection to the bridges with Super Bowl 52. And then his name is named after the same person that San Francisco gets its name from. So it just seems, there's something important to that. There's a bridge symbolism. It's interesting. The Super Bowl is going to be in, San Francisco this year. There's a Golden Gate Bridge there. And then Pope Francis equals 209. And the Donald Trump assassination was 209 days. Whatever I said after or before his birthday. And if you write out Donald Trump in these composite ciphers, Donald Trump equals 233. And then, like I said, Zach made these videos 233 days before Pope Francis died. Also 7 months, 21 days, what makes me think of Zach's birthday, but 233 days. And if you go from Aleister Crowley's death day to Zach's birthday, it just so happens to be 233 days, a span of 233 days. If you go from my birthday, well, I can't even type my own birthday out, 11/10/24, and you go to the date, jeez, I can't even think of it, 23/3, right? It is actually it's the other way, that's why I'm not getting it. If you go from my birthday is 233 days after 23/3, a span, so. And I've been following the date 8/6 again a whole lot, and it had to do with the Tisha B'Av from 2019 that was related to the Golden Gate Bridge. So I just feel like there's something to that, and if you go from Pope Francis's birthday to the date August 6th, the date important to my book, it just so happens to be a span of 233 days. And if you go from his death day to August 6th, it just so happens to be 3 months and 16 days. 107 sticks out because I'm pretty sure bridge equals 107. Let me look it up really quick. Or 117 for bridge. Earthquake equals 107 though. There seems to be something very important to that, and I've been trying to figure this out for a while. Let me look at Golden Gate Bridge again. Golden Gate Bridge. Once again, the same as earthquake. I'll have to look at some of these with the composite numbers. Remember, Super Bowl 52 with the bridge stuff was all about 81 though. And the 81st anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge was that year as well. Pretty sure it'll be the 88th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge here in another month. August 6th too. August 6th is the 218th day of the year. And this is a huge number with Donald Trump, right? If you write out Trump, it equals 218. If you write out Donald, it equals 218. February 18th is the day that leaves 316 days in the year. August 21st, which can be written as 21/8, is the 233rd day. So, and there's a whole bunch more to that as well. Remember the presidential alert that all had to do with 218? So, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out the riddle here. Now that Pope Francis has died, talk about bridge builder, bridge maker. There seems to be something with how it relates to the Father's symbolism and this bridge symbolism, especially with this connection to San Francisco. But I'm going to keep going so I can finish this video. It's like almost 4 in the morning, but if you read out Pope Francis in the reverse composite cipher, this is another interesting thing in relation to that post about Joseph Aquaviva's father and Mark Passio's father, because 284 is the 222nd composite number. And if you watch the videos that Zach made about Joseph Aquaviva's father and such, another big number he talked about was the number 222. And Joseph Aquaviva, I believe his favorite number is 222. If it's not, then that's what he puts on his channel, at least 222. And, whatever, 222. You can see it right there. But Zach connected it to the superior general of the Jesuits that had the Aquaviva name or something like that. And superior general equals 222. The interesting thing about that is the current superior general of the Jesuits was born on the 316th day of the year, 316. But that's also Charles Manson's birthday. Charles Manson has that big connection to Marilyn Manson. Charles Manson also equals 209, just like Pope Francis. Charles Manson's his full name equals 316. So, you don't always have to connect it to the Jesuits is the point, but Zach connected it to the superior general equals 222. But nobody pointed out how Joseph Aquaviva equals 222 in the Francis Bacon ciphers. Mark Passio also, Zach had a post about how Mark Passio's wife died on 222 in there. 222 right here. So, what are the odds? Superior General 222. Joseph Aquaviva's favorite number, I think, is 222. Pope Francis in the composite ciphers, his name equals 284, which is the 222nd composite number. Mark Passio's wife dies on 222. Zach made these videos 222 days before my father's birthday. Zach's parents are born 222 days apart as well. So they're born 4 months, 21 days, and also 222 days apart. He just changed his channel name, Zach did, to Number Games, which is a reference to his book that came out connected to the Jesuits on Amazon and so on. And then later it was all super connected to when he went to Andy No to Powell's bookstore. I'll just leave that out of there. But his book released on Amazon 2 months and 22 days after his birthday. And I don't know for sure the days of their birthdays. Joseph Aquaviva's birthday is May 22nd, but Zach has 2 different birthdays for Mark Passio on his blog. But one of them says August 12th, which would mean that Joseph Aquaviva and Mark Passio's birthdays are 2 months and 22 days apart even. And it gets even deeper when you look at composite numbers because, once again, so Pope Francis in the reverse composite cipher equals 284, the 222nd composite. Pope Francis also equals 174, the capital letter ciphers. The 174th composite just so happens to be 222. And if you read out Mark Passio, he also equals 174 in that same exact cipher. So that connection to 222. Pope Francis also just died, let's see here, 174 days before the birthday of Aleister Crowley. 174. Connection to 222. If you go from the stock market crash anniversary to the day that Pope Francis died, it's also 174 days. So, this narrative I'm talking about seems legit. And then in relation to 222, remember, when I had the dream about the psychic's husband dying, and he died 4 months and 18 days after her birthday, and her name equals 418. Her birthday, 222, remember? Also, if you go from the day Zach made these videos to the date 222, just so happens to be 174 days. Once again, the connection to 222. And then think about how Zach became a father this year on November 16th. And his daughter was born a span of 222 days before his wife's birthday, 222. And then look at his daughter's name in Gematria. Ruby Hubbard, 174. And all these other ones connected to Pope Francis. It's unbelievable. But 174. And remember that Pope Francis died 209 days before her birthday. And Pope Francis equals 209 in the composite cipher. Also, if you read out her full name, which I really thought she was going to be born on 418 because, or on 1111 because that had a big connection to 418. But, you know, her middle name's 11 too. I don't know, it's just interesting considering Zach has always been Zachary K. Hubbard, the 11th letter. Think about how Aleister Crowley added the K to the word magic. Think about how 11 is a master number. I mean, there's just a lot of interesting things with it. Her name even equals 94, like Zach Hubbard, like Seattle, Washington, like all that stuff I was talking about with Rambo. It even equals 185, like Donald John Trump, like stock market crash. It's unbelievable. Pope Francis even died a span of 5 months and 6 days after her birthday, and her name equals 263, which is the 56th prime number. I mean, you go on and on and on and on and on here, but notice that her name equals 352, which is interesting because to these composite ciphers, because if you read out Aleister Crowley, it equals 352. And Pope Francis's birthday was on the 352nd day of the year. And she was born 352 days after the death anniversary of Aleister Crowley. And remember how I was talking earlier, how I said there was a connection to two fathers, so we made the video about the two fathers. Then there was the story in the news about the two fathers, right? And I thought maybe it's connected to Pope Francis and this priest that I had as a kid. Notice his name equals 352. The priest that just died in Erling, Iowa, and connected to the movie coming out and the Erling exorcism, and Father Howard used to be a priest in Erling, Iowa as well. His name had the connection to 352. And also if you read out Father Howard, this Father Howard, what I used to call him, his name has the connection to 316, 316. And in a non-leap year, if you go from this guy's birthday, 111, to the day that Zach put them videos out, 9-1, about the two fathers, just so happens to be 233 days later. So on any other year, besides 2024, or non-leap years, that video is going to come out 233 days after Father Howard's birthday. So I guess we'll see, you know. Like I said, August 6th just seems so important. Especially like when I think back on I learned about the lady being the psychic. It was right after my book came out. And the first copy of my book I got was from Middletown, Delaware. And after that book had a bunch of stuff to do with train symbolism. And it was linked up to the psychic's husband who died next to the train tracks that looked like the 9-inch nails. And he died right before the highway turns into Railroad Highway. And it's right before Minden, Iowa. And if you go back to when I got my first copy of my book, I was talking about how I thought there was something important to train wrecks. Maybe we get a train wreck. Maybe we'll get a school shooting or a volcano eruption. The very next day, we got a train wreck in Joplin, Montana. Then we got a volcano eruption in Hawaii, like a couple days later. And when I was having all that number 9 stuff in February of 2024, Amy Schumer was in the news, like with the movie Trainwreck. Then John Cena was naked on the Oscars or whatever. He's in the movie Trainwreck. There's all kinds of stuff with Trainwreck. And I pointed out how I thought there might be a connection to Minden, Iowa, and how Joplin Montana reminded me of Joplin, Missouri, and the tornadoes. And then Minden, Iowa got destroyed by a tornado back in April of 2024. But I feel like there's something important to J.D. Vance being from Middletown, Ohio, with all of that. And of course, Pope Francis was also linked up to the movie Trainwreck with his visit to the United States in 2015, the number 923. I guess the point I'm making though is in 2021, right after I released my book, that's when I noticed all the psychic stuff. And I started talking about Middletown, Delaware. But my book is all about the number 86. So it just makes me think there's something important to that, especially when that was a big thing that I was following August 6th and August 10th in relation to Tisha B'Av in 2019. That had to do with the Golden Gate Bridge. So, I mean, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't know. It just seems to be very important. It seems that's what I'm supposed to get out of it. Something to do with that date. But I'm probably going to end the video there. I do have some other things I want to talk about, but it's just about how the Trump assassination attempt was on the second one was on Dan Marino's birthday, and the shooter was from Hawaii. And, you know, think about Tua, the quarterback of the Dolphins, who's from Hawaii. And Dan Marino's father died 3 months and 16 days after his birthday. And he died 4 months and 18 days before Tua's father's birthday. The shooter at that golf course at the second one, his name equaled 418. And his birthday was 218, the day leaving 316 days in the year. That assassination attempt was on the day leaving 316 days of the year. But there's something going on with the dream theme as well with that, because my neighbor had it's a long story, but I didn't show up to something on time, and my neighbor thought I died because she had a dream that I died. And her name equals 184 in the composite cipher, which is linked to that father symbolism. But that dream was on 11/25, and I'm talking about how my friend gave me a Tua jersey back in right after that, right? And then after I was talking all about this stuff again with this dream, my friend actually he left a jersey in my car again because he bought me some, because I used to always wear my old Merino one that's all ripped up or whatever. And he bought me a Jalen Waddle jersey. And Jalen Waddle's birthday just so happens to be November 25th. And there was a bunch of syncs to my father. I'm not going to talk about it because I'm tired. Too much to re-explain, but there was a father symbolism thing going on. And Donald Trump also, that second one was at a golf course, right? And oddly enough, right after that, I was in a golf tournament last summer. And I barely golf anymore, but I was in a golf tournament last summer. It ended up being 316 days after my birthday. And my nephew was supposed to golf, and his name equals 184. And 316, I didn't even see that before. His name equals these numbers. And he never ended up showing up. He had to work or something. And my dad ended up golfing with us, and my dad has like a blown out shoulder. He could barely even swing a golf club, but we just had him just ride along and drink beer with us. And he hit like maybe 3 times. But it's funny that my dad replaced somebody who equaled 184, and it was 316 days after my birthday. And my nephew was supposed to golf with us, and he has the connection to 316 and the father symbolism number. And then, like I showed earlier, Zach made the video about the 2 fathers. Then there was a headline story about 2 fathers. Then we had James Earl Jones and John Amos die. And they were the 2 fathers on Coming to America. We also had Dikembe Mutombo, who's in Coming to America, die. And his wife's name's Rose. And Pete Rose had just died. And Derek Rose had announced his retirement. And I got on Facebook, and right around that same time, and a girl who I used to know, her last name was Bentz, but now it's married, and her married name is Rose. And she posted about the death of her father, who died years before. But his name equaled 222 and also 316. And her name equaled 222. Right around the same time of all the Rose stuff. And it was even linked up, the guy from Beverly Hills Cop died. And there was a big Rose theme in that new movie with Rosewood. And he wore a Guns N' Roses shirt the whole movie and a whole bunch of stuff. So, and that all links back to Charles Manson, who was born on the 316th day of the year. There's so much to explain, but following this pattern, it's all connected to 421 and Pope Francis dying as well. And then Zach does the video with American fathers, and his name equals 316, and it was 4 months and 21 days before his birthday. And that live stream just so happened to be on the date 2/3, which was the day I had the dream about getting all number 9s 9 days before I won $10,000 last year. And it was also 141 days before that guy's birthday, and my dad's name thought it equaled 141 anyway. Yeah, 141. And that's interesting because the 141st composite just so happens to be 184, the father symbolism numbers. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully you get the gist of it. I know it's very long and detailed, but there was something going on with how the composite numbers are connected to Aleister Crowley and father symbolism, and now we got the death of Pope Francis. I'm interested to see this movie that's going to be coming out called The Ritual, especially considering that priest from the town of Erling, Iowa died on my father's birthday. There's something going on with father symbolism, so. Have a good one. Peace. Oh, I can't end it right now, can I? It's 4:18. I gotta wait like 1 minute, don't I? Hold on. That's crazy. I was gonna end the video, and then I'm like, no way, it's 4:18. But yeah, just so much going on. Hopefully, if I get time, I have to learn a few songs on guitar, on bass tomorrow before my gig, but if I get time, I really want to make a video just talking about Gematria in general, too. Like, there's so much, there has to be a reason that you're bringing things up, if that makes sense. And I just feel like a lot of people aren't doing that. A lot of people are just placing phrases and whatever to make it fit some narrative. I mean, I sort of do that in a sense, but I realize that I'm using mysticism. And a lot of people don't realize that, and they think it's all like this ritual thing, which in a sense, it could be rituals, and there's just so much more going on with it as also. And I don't mean to disrespect anybody, but I feel like it's not advancing, and more people need to. I feel like so many people are getting stuck for a very long time in this level of understanding. And I don't want people to be stuck as long as I was on that level of understanding. And now I have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. And, the videos need to be made. Maybe somebody will stumble upon it and it will help them advance their level, I feel like whatever's guiding me wants me to make that video and keep pushing it. Like, I feel like it's like part of what I'm supposed to do. So we'll end it right now. It's not even 4:21. We'll just end it right now. 4:20. Have a good one. Peace.